He signed the divorce papers with a smirk, thinking he was leaving a broke wife. He had no idea I inherited the $180 billion real estate empire he worked for. I was about to become the new boss who would end his career. Outside, a blizzard battered the glass walls of the penthouse. Inside, the silence felt heavy and cold. Dominic adjusted his platinum watch, a heavy weight on his wrist. He did not look at me once. Dominic slid the document across the mahogany table. His movements were fluid and arrogant. He believed this was a clean break from dead weight. He told me to find a studio near the museum because it fit my dusty life. His voice dripped with a false pity that made my skin crawl. He was already checking his phone for flight updates to Aspen. He thought I was a fragile relic. He never noticed the trapdoor I had built beneath his expensive shoes. Judge Keats entered the room with a sharp click of heels. She carried a thick cream envelope sealed with red wax. Dominic groaned and checked his chronometer again. He told her he had a private jet waiting at the airfield. The judge did not flinch at his tone. She placed the envelope between us like a loaded weapon. Dominic rolled his eyes, assuming this was about my mother's old thimbles. He didn't see the judge's hand tremble, with a hidden anticipation. The judge broke the seal, with a sound like a snapping bone. She read the testament execution for the estate of Victoria Vance. My husband's thumb froze over his screen as the numbers filled the air. $180 billion in global assets were now mine. The room seemed to tilt on its axis. Dominic went pale, the color draining from his face in seconds. He whispered the number like it was a foreign language. He realized the world had shifted. The portfolio included Obsidian Capital, the firm where Dominic worked. I finally spoke, my voice calm and devoid of anger. I told him I was V. Moore, the board chair he had insulted for years. He called me a dinosaur in his private memos. He spent 2 years fighting his own boss without ever seeing my face. His arrogance was fracturing into 1,000 jagged pieces. He gripped the edge of the table. He looked at me as if I were a stranger. I watched the realization hit him in cold, hard waves. This was not regret. It was a desperate calculation. He was rewinding 7 years of lies in his head. He looked for clues he had missed in our quiet home. He never looked down at the bedrock beneath him. I handed him the blueprint he once used as a coaster. He thought he was the architect of our future. He had no idea I had already signed the demolition orders. Dominic stood frozen as the blizzard rattled the glass. His eyes darted to the cream envelope on the table. He finally realized his paycheck came from me. His phone buzzed with a text from Bianca. He ignored it. "This is impossible," he whispered. His voice was thin and hollow. I didn't blink or offer him comfort. I simply watched his hands shake. He reached for his coat but stopped midway. His confidence had completely vanished. "I built your career, Dominic." I stood up slowly. I walked toward the window overlooking the white static. I saw his reflection in the dark glass. He looked small against the skyline. He was nothing but a liability now. "Wet, we can talk," he stammered. He tried to summon his old charm. It failed. I didn't want his words anymore. I wanted the truth about the missing funds. He stepped back as I turned. He looked trapped. The judge cleared her throat loudly. She slid a second file toward me. It contained the forensic audit of the Midwest properties. Dominic saw the red markings on the page. His face turned gray. He knew I knew. "That's a clerical error," he lied. I didn't respond. I pushed the intercom button on the console. Security was already on the way up. Then, my phone chimed with a headline. Dominic had just leaked the smear piece. The headline hit my screen like a physical blow. "Unstable Harris threatens market stability." Dominic watched me, a slow, ugly grin returning to his mouth. He thought his media contact had saved him. The article painted me as a scorned wife acting out of pure hysteria. It claimed I was using my new wealth to settle a petty personal score. Dominic leaned against the table, his confidence rebuilding. He believed he still owned the public narrative. He reached for his coat with a steady hand. He told me the board would panic if the stock dropped 10 points. If they felt the company was unstable, they would force a vote of no confidence. He demanded his $6 million severance package right now. If I signed, the article would be retracted within the hour. If I refused, he promised to burn my family legacy to the ground. He looked like a man holding a winning hand. I didn't reply to his crude threats. I simply looked at the silver flash drive Bianca had given me. It felt cold against my palm. Dominic didn't realize his assistant had already switched sides. He thought his secrets were safe on his private servers. I opened my laptop and logged into the Obsidian secure system. I sent a single message to the head of IT. I ordered an immediate level 5 forensic audit of his hard drives. Dominic's lawyer whispered something in his ear. The man's expression shifted from triumph to deep concern. He saw the audit notification pop up on his own tablet. The room suddenly felt smaller and much hotter. Dominic's smirk faltered as he realized I wasn't backing down. He tried to grab my laptop, but the judge stood in his way. Her presence was a silent wall of legal steel. He was losing his grip on the situation fast. I stood up and walked to the door. I told Dominic that historians always know how to dig. We don't fear the past, we document it. His smear campaign was a war of words, but I preferred data. The forensic team was already mirroring his devices in the basement. They would find the phantom leases within minutes. He wasn't just a bad husband anymore. He was a federal liability. The lawyer stepped away from him, sensing the coming blast. 2 security guards appeared in the hallway. They were men Dominic had ignored for 5 long years. Now, they stood tall and waited for my signal. I didn't give the order to remove him yet. I wanted him to see the first wave of the audit results. A red light flashed on the boardroom console. The system had detected unauthorized transfers to an offshore account. Dominic's face went from pale to a sickly gray. His lawyer dropped his briefcase. The heavy doors hissed open. A woman I didn't recognize walked in with a panicked expression. She held a tablet displaying the livestock market feed. The shares weren't dropping as Dominic had predicted. They were rising because of a rumor about a massive merger. The board wasn't panicking about my mental state. They were excited about the new capital I brought. Dominic realized his leverage was gone. Then, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. The unknown message was a single image of a document. It was a wire transfer receipt from my mother's private bank account. Dominic had forged her signature 6 months before she died. My breath hitched as I realized his betrayal went deeper than business. He hadn't just neglected her funeral. He had been robbing her while she was too sick to fight back. I looked at him, and the last shred of my restraint finally snapped. Dominic noticed my change in posture. He tried to pivot back to his legal defense. He claimed the offshore accounts were just tax shelters for the company. He said every vice president used them. His lawyer looked at the floor, refusing to meet my eyes. The man knew a sinking ship when he saw one. I showed the screen to the judge. Her face hardened into a mask of pure judicial fury. The air in the room turned ice. "I didn't do that," Dominic stammered. He reached for his phone, but the judge signaled for security to intervene. The guard stepped forward and took the device from his shaking hand. Dominic looked like a cornered animal. He started to ramble about the board members who supported him. He mentioned names of men who were already distancing themselves. He was losing his mind in real time. The power dynamic had shifted completely in my favor. I walked to the head of the table. I told him the board had just voted. They weren't coming to save him. They had seen the first few pages of the audit. The phantom leasing scheme was too toxic for anyone to defend. His allies had turned into his executioners to save their own skin. Dominic sat down heavily in his leather chair. It was the chair he thought he would occupy forever. Now it was just a cage. The forensic accountant entered the room with a printed sheet. He pointed to the Sterling clause in the 2021 contract. This was the specific rule Dominic wrote to fire a rival last year. It stated that any executive caught falsifying data forfeited everything. No severance, no stock, and no second chances. He had sharpened the blade that was now at his own throat. The irony was a cold weight in the room. Dominic stared at his own signature. "You can't do this to me," he whispered. He looked at the floor-to-ceiling windows. The blizzard had stopped. Leaving the city in a white shroud, he was thinking about the Aspen trip and the condo. All of it was tied to the stock he just lost. He was effectively broke. I told him he had 10 minutes to leave the building. He wasn't allowed to take a single file or personal item. His life was being erased. He stood up and walked toward the door without a word. The guards followed him closely, their hands on their belts. He looked small and defeated in his expensive cashmere coat. Just as he reached the threshold, he stopped and turned around. He looked at me with a spark of pure, concentrated hatred. He said he would see me in court. Then, he dropped a final, chilling secret. He said he wasn't the only one who signed those papers. Dominic's parting shot hung in the frigid air. I didn't let him see me flinch. I watched the heavy doors close behind him and his disgraced lawyer. The boardroom was silent, but the tension remained thick. I turned to Judge Keats, searching her face for any sign of a hidden co-signer. She remained stoic, her eyes fixed on the thick stack of audit papers. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. There was one more secret. "Who else signed them, Judge?" I asked. My voice remained steady despite the storm inside me. She hesitated before pulling a dusty ledger from her leather briefcase. It was an old document from the early days of Obsidian Capital. My father had founded the firm with a silent partner decades ago. I had always assumed he was the sole visionary behind the empire. The judge turned to the final page and pointed to a faded ink signature. My blood ran cold. The signature wasn't my father's or Dominic's. It belonged to Bianca's father, a man who had vanished years ago. He was the ghost in the machine of the Vance legacy. Dominic hadn't just used Bianca for an affair. He had been using her for her hereditary access to the secure vault. My objective shifted from cleaning the firm to protecting the vault's contents. I needed to find Bianca before she realized the magnitude of her father's old debt. I grabbed my phone and called security on the lower levels. They reported that Bianca had left the building 5 minutes ago. She was headed toward the subway in the worsening city slush. I grabbed my coat and ran for the private elevator. The realization that my empire was built on a lie tasted like copper. Dominic had known this from the very beginning of our marriage. He had targeted me for the vault, not just the name. The elevator descended rapidly through the 60 floors of glass and steel. I watched the floor numbers flash in the polished chrome reflection. I was the chairwoman, but I felt like a prey animal. My power was vast, yet it felt incredibly fragile in this moment. If Bianca opened that vault, the entire global portfolio would technically default. The Vance family trust was anchored to a secret that was no longer mine to keep. The elevator door opened. The lobby was a blur of marble and frantic evening commuters. I spotted Bianca near the revolving doors, her silver coat shimmering in the light. She looked over her shoulder, her eyes wide with a new kind of terror. She wasn't running from me. She was running from the men in dark suits waiting by the curb. They weren't Obsidian security, and they certainly weren't the police. A black SUV pulled up onto the sidewalk, blocking her only exit. I reached out to grab her arm, pulling her back into the shadows. The men stepped out of the vehicle with a coordinated, lethal grace. One of them held a tablet identical to the one Dominic had used. They weren't here for the company or the board. They were here for the physical key Bianca carried around her neck. I realized then that Dominic had sold the vault's location to a rival entity. We weren't alone in this cold city. I yanked Bianca behind a massive marble pillar as the SUV doors clicked open. The lobby air tasted like ozone and wet pavement. I could feel her heart racing through the thin fabric of her silver coat. Those men weren't looking for a corporate merger. They were hunting for the physical key resting against her chest. I told her to stay silent and keep her head down. She gripped my hand with a strength born of pure terror. We were targets in my own building. The lead man scanned the lobby with a professional, predatory gaze. He adjusted his earpiece, ignoring the commuters rushing toward the subway. Dominic had clearly traded our safety for a chance at a new life. He sold the vault location to a shadow entity before the elevator even hit the ground. I realized then that my $180 billion empire was built on quicksand. The Vance family's secret was a liability I hadn't prepared for. I needed to get us to the sub-basement. We moved through the shadows of the executive lounge, heading for the service stairs. I kept my hand on Bianca's shoulder, guiding her through the dim corridor. Every floorboard creaked like a warning in the sudden silence. The men in suits were already moving toward the elevators. They had a digital override that could bypass my security protocols. I felt a cold chill settle deep in my bones. My methodical patience was being tested by raw, physical violence. We reached the heavy steel door. I shoved the door open and pulled Bianca into the stairwell. The air here was colder, smelling of concrete and old machinery. We began the long descent into the guts of the skyscraper. My heels clicked rhythmically against the metal grating. I told Bianca to take off her shoes to dampen the sound. She obeyed instantly, her eyes never leaving the door above us. We were descending into the dark heart of my father's legacy. The stairs seemed to go on forever. Halfway down, a sharp metallic clang echoed from the floors above. They were in the stairwell. My breathing hitched as I calculated the distance to the vault. We had 3 floors left, but they were moving faster than us. I looked at Bianca and saw the key glinting in the dim emergency light. It was a simple brass object, yet it held the power to collapse a global economy. I realized my father hadn't just built a company. He had built a sanctuary for a lie. We reached the sub-basement level and burst into the hum of the server room. The cooling fans roared with an aggressive, mechanical hunger. I led Bianca past the glowing blue towers of data toward the back wall. There was a small, inconspicuous door hidden behind a rack of cables. My hands shook as I entered the biometric code. The scanners turned green, and the heavy door hissed open. We stepped into a small, sterile room. The silence here was absolute and terrifying. The vault sat in the center of the room, a masterpiece of clockwork and steel. It was a physical manifestation of the Vance family's true power. I told Bianca to hand me the key. She reached for the chain around her neck, but her fingers froze. She looked at me with a sudden, sharp realization. She asked me if I knew what was actually inside the box. I didn't have an answer for her. I only knew we had to protect it from the men outside. The sound of the server room door being kicked open shattered the peace. I grabbed the key from her hand and jammed it into the lock. The gears began to grind. A slow and ancient sound. I felt the vibration through the floor. The lead man stepped into the sterile room, his weapon drawn. He didn't look at Bianca. He looked only at the vault. He told me to step away from the door. I refused to move. I was the architect of this moment. The vault door swung open with a pressurized sigh. I expected gold bars or incriminating ledgers. Instead, The interior was lined with rows of small, glass vials. Each one was filled with a shimmering, iridescent liquid. The man in the suit lowered his weapon in genuine surprise. He hadn't expected this either. Bianca let out a small, choked gasp. I realized then that the Vance wealth wasn't tied to real estate at all. It was tied to something far more dangerous. The man stepped forward to claim the vials, but a new voice stopped him. Dominic stood in the doorway. His cashmere coat stained with slush. He looked older, his face twisted by greed and desperation. He held a remote detonator in his hand. He told us that if he couldn't have the legacy, nobody would. The red light on the device began to pulse. I looked at the vials, then back at my ex-husband. The final structural collapse of my life had begun. Dominic's thumb hovered over the detonator, his eyes bloodshot and wide. The red light pulsed against his pale skin like a dying heart. I stood between him and the iridescent vials, my back against the cold steel. The man in the suit remained motionless, his tactical training warring with the sudden threat of total annihilation. Bianca was a statue of terror beside me, her breath hitching in the sterile air. One spark would vaporize the history of the Vance family. The silence was a physical weight. "You really think this is the end, Dominic?" My voice was a low, steady blade. I didn't look at the bomb. I looked at the man who had slept beside me for 7 years. He was a hollow shell of ambition and bitterness. He screamed that I had stolen his life, his condo, and his pride. He didn't understand that he had never truly owned any of it. He was a tenant in a house built by giants. He pressed the button halfway down. A sharp, digital chirp echoed through the vault, but no explosion followed. Dominic's face twisted in confusion as he mashed the trigger repeatedly. Nothing happened. I pulled my phone from my coat pocket and showed him the screen. I had activated a signal jammer, using my phone the moment I entered the server room. The server room's proximity made it easy to flood the frequency with white noise. His high-tech threat was now a useless plastic toy. The power shifted back to the bedrock. The man in the suit didn't wait for a second chance. He lunged forward, disarming Dominic with a brutal, efficient strike. My ex-husband collapsed against the server racks, his cashmere coat tearing on a sharp metal edge. The tactical agent didn't care about the domestic drama. He turned his attention back to the glass vials, his hand reaching for the shimmering liquid. He told me these were the proprietary patents for a new synthetic energy source. I finally understood the true source of our wealth. "Don't touch them," I warned, stepping into his path. The agent leveled his suppressed pistol at my chest. He said his employers had paid a high price for this discovery. They didn't care about real estate or boardrooms. They wanted the formula that could rewrite the global power grid. I realized my father hadn't been a developer. He was a guardian of a scientific revolution. The real estate empire was just a massive, multi-billion-dollar camouflage. The truth felt like lead. Bianca suddenly spoke up. Her voice surprisingly sharp and clear. She told the agent that the vials were coded to a specific DNA sequence. Without the correct biological match, the liquid would inertly degrade within 60 seconds of removal. She was her father's daughter after all. She held the secret to the stability of the Vance legacy. The agent hesitated, his finger tightening on the trigger. He looked at Bianca with a new, lethal interest. She had become the most valuable asset. I moved closer to Bianca, shielding her with my body. I told the agent that killing us would ensure he left with nothing but useless glass. We were the only 2 living links to the Vance biological key. He looked at the vials, then at the 2 women standing in the dark. He was a professional, and professionals knew when a mission had changed. He lowered his weapon slowly, but he didn't put it away. He was waiting for a better opening. Dominic groaned on the floor, clutching his broken wrist. He looked at the vials with a mixture of awe and pure, unfiltered hatred. He had spent years looking for a hidden vault of cash. He never suspected he was sitting on a breakthrough that could end the oil age. He called us both witches, his voice thick with a pathetic, dying spite. I didn't even look at him. He was already a ghost. My focus remained on the tactical threat standing before us. The server room's emergency lights began to flicker as the jammer strained the local power. A low hum started to vibrate through the floorboards. The internal security protocols were finally reacting to the breach. I told the agent that the building was going into total lockdown. In 30 seconds, the room would be flooded with nitrogen to protect the servers. He would suffocate before he could reach the elevator. He looked at the vents and then at the exit. He made his choice. The man in the suit turned and sprinted toward the door, vanishing into the blue glow of the racks. I grabbed Bianca's hand and slammed the vault shut, twisting the brass key. The pressurized hiss sealed the iridescent vials back into the darkness. We were alone with a broken man and a dying light. I felt a strange sense of peace as the nitrogen sirens began to wail. But then, I noticed the vault's digital display. The countdown hadn't stopped at all. The siren's wail cut through the roar of the cooling fans. I dragged Bianca toward the heavy steel exit. Dominic lay defeated on the floor, his eyes fixed on the pulsing red numbers. The vault display showed 20 seconds until the nitrogen purge. I realized the jammer had inadvertently triggered a high security fail safe. It was a dead man switch my father installed to protect the vault during a signal breach. We had moments to reach the stairs, or we would suffocate in the dark. The air tasted metallic. We burst into the stairwell just as the heavy doors hissed shut. I heard the muffled roar of the gas flooding the server room behind us. Dominic was trapped inside, his desperate pounding silenced by the reinforced steel. I didn't look back at the man who had tried to ruin me. My focus was on the street level and the freezing city air. Bianca's hand was a cold knot in mine. We climbed toward the light with everything we had left. The lobby was a ghost town of marble and shadows. The tactical team had vanished into the blizzard, leaving only a few spent shell casings behind. I led Bianca out the revolving doors into the biting wind. The cold was a shock that cleared the last of my panic. I realized the vials were safe, buried beneath 60 floors of skyscraper. My father's secret was preserved, but the war was far from over. I looked at the dark SUV. I didn't feel the urge to cry or scream at the sky. I felt a cold, clinical clarity that only a historian could possess. Dominic was gone, erased by his own desperate greed and short-sightedness. I was the owner of a real estate empire and a scientific revolution. My value was no longer tied to my silence or my service. I was the architect of a new world order. I adjusted my coat and checked the Market Watch app. The Obsidian stock had stabilized after the merger rumors. The board was waiting for my next move with bated breath. I told Bianca to go to a safe house I owned in Brooklyn. She nodded, her eyes reflecting the amber glow of the city lights. I watched her disappear into the white static of the storm. I stood alone on the sidewalk, a billionaire with no home and a dangerous future. My mother's legacy was finally back in my hands. I reached into my pocket and felt the brass vault key. It was a small weight with a massive consequence. I realized then that Judge Keats was waiting for me at the town car. She held a final document that hadn't been part of the trust. It was a letter from my father addressed to V. Moore. I opened it with shaking fingers as the car pulled away. The first line was a warning about the silent partner. He was still alive,